Again, good evening. Robert's going to continue handing out pencils, and we will get to that sheet of paper here in a few minutes. That's hot. So tonight we're going to be looking at Hebrews chapter 11. And I'm going to read the first 3 verses, and then I'm going to talk about what comes after that. And this is coming from the New King James Version. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good testimony. By faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. And the writer of Hebrews goes on to talk about Abel, to talk about Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, and Joseph. And he's kind of given, when I was at UGA, we kind of went through chapter 11 of Hebrews, but we called it the Hall of Fame. And so you kind of have the Hall of Fame of, the founders of our faith right here. Not including the New Testament, because I would definitely throw Paul and Peter and Jesus in there. But in there, you kind of have what I would call an established legacy. Because you can go back, and you can go back to the beginning of the Old Testament, and you can go back to Genesis, and you can see that there's this legacy that has started, and it's passed down from generation to generation. And so we're looking at this, and Hebrews 11 calls it a cloud of witnesses. Those commended in Hebrews 11 were far from perfect. These were not perfect people. They were flawed people. We can go back to each individual story, short of maybe Abel, just because he wasn't alive long enough for us to hear a story of him messing up. But you can go back to every other character that was listed and see where that person messed up. And not just messed up. They messed up pretty royally. Moses murdered somebody. How many murderers do we have in the room that you physically killed somebody? Nobody raised their hand. Good. It was about to get awkward. But they are commended by the faith that they had in Jesus and in God. Because they followed God's guidance. When God said, specifically like to Abraham, when he said to Abraham, go. I will show you where you're going, but just go. He doesn't tell Abraham where he's going, or at that time, Abram. He just says, go. Walk. Go somewhere. And I'll show you where to go. How many of us would be willing to just start on this trek across the country and not knowing where God's taking us, and just you start driving? Most of us want to have a plan. We want to go, okay, we're starting here, and this is our end goal, and this is where we're going, and here's the path, and here's all the different roads we got to go on. That's what I do, at least. Here's how many miles it is. Here's how much it takes to fill up the car. This is how much it's going to cost me to get there and back. And that's all the normal stuff when you're planning a trip. But God just said, okay, Abram, go. And he went. How many of us would have that kind of faith? I would hope we all would. But when we actually get down to ourselves, our answer may not be, okay, God, I'll go. And he's not done working on us yet in that page. Not only did they live by faith when it was easy, they did it when it was difficult. And Abraham's also a good example. But Joseph comes to mind about when it was difficult. Think about when he was in Potiphar's house, and Potiphar's wife came and tried to seduce him. And he got out of that room so fast, he left behind his outer cloak. And that's what she used to frame him for trying to rape her. That's what ended up getting him in jail. But that was all part of God's plan. Joseph still had faith, even in the tough times. And even with faith, it was never a guarantee that life would go smoothly. I've lived that already. I'm not that old, I realize that, but I've already lived it. That's a time for another story. Sometimes they were victorious in their life. When Moses drove that rod into the ground and the sea split, that would be a victory. When Joseph stored up all that food for 7 years, preparing for the famine that was coming, and he got to save his nation, that's a victory. But those weren't the only parts of the story, because there were others in here that suffered and suffered greatly. I'll tell this story now.
Go for it.
So, the day I got tested for COVID was the day that he got the news he was retiring. And so it was a pretty hard day, because I tested positive for COVID and learned that my dad wasn't going to have his job anymore. It was a hard day, especially when you're right on the cusp and you've just started feeling your symptoms from COVID. And so it really got me thinking, because 2 weekends after that was the statewide conference for college students that he used to hold every year at Eagles Landing First Baptist Church in McDonough, Georgia. And he called it Confluence, and we've done that since
forever.
2001, 2000, something like that. And so we ended up going there, and they got to do a recognition for my dad, and just in that process, I started thinking about legacy. And that's kind of what spurred this on for me, because something that you guys don't know, and I've told a few people here this story. One of the reasons I prepared a chair for him tonight. In 1991, Dad had been at the convention 8 years.
That would be 8 years.
8 years. And he had just, 6 months before I was born, he had begun to work at the state convention. Before that, he was campus minister at Barrett College in Rome, Georgia. And so in 1991, he and a guy by the name of Eugene Briscoe. You would never know Eugene Briscoe. He's never somebody that you would have ever cross paths with, probably. But he's the reason I'm standing here. I can say that with certainty. He is the reason I'm standing here, because he is the guy that came up to Southern Baptist Convention and interviewed my dad and hired him to be the campus minister at Rome, Georgia. And so he is the reason this Mountain Virginia boy came to the foreign mission field of Georgia.
Yes.
And my grandmother would agree with that statement.
Both of them.
Well, she blames my mom, or she did, but and so in 1991, Dad and Eugene Briscoe were on their way to
Cochrane
to put in place a campus minister to begin to minister to Middle Georgia College, State University, I forget. And so they were on the road, and my dad was driving. Eugene Briscoe was in the passenger seat, and they're driving along. I don't remember it that way.
Just tell the story.
Anyways,
It doesn't matter.
they're driving along, doing nothing wrong. A truck in the opposite direction, runs off the road, overcorrects, and hits them head on. I am lucky my dad is sitting here right now, because as I remember, there was, I think it was 2 cars behind, there was a nurse in that car and started working on my dad immediately. Eugene Briscoe passed away in that wreck. He is the one and only
First of two
state convention employees to die while on the mission field in Georgia. That it took that long is a blessing for something like that to happen. And so I'm 4 at this point. I vaguely remember details. I remember when he got home and he took his first shower. That was not a good experience. I'll just keep it there. And then I remember the first night after he got home, I'm 4, my sister is 8. So my sister's understanding a little bit more of what's going on than I was. And my mom tells us to go say goodnight to Dad. And I'm 4. That Jed's a little older than I was at this point. If you see Jed come up to me, more than likely when you see him, he's going to, especially if he's got steps, he's going to be running and jumping into my arms. And so I remember running around the bed, and I jumped. And Mom caught me in midair. I remember that part. But the point of the story is not to make you feel bad for us or to make you feel bad for what happened. It is to realize that Eugene Briscoe came on staff at the state convention in 1956.
A little after that.
Somewhere around there. And he was in charge of the Collegiate Ministries Department of the Commission until 1991. There was a couple of guys who filled that leader position at the state convention until, I'm going to say it this way, until the people that were making decisions finally figured out that they should put him in there right after Eugene Briscoe. I can say that for it. And so it was just in this process that I realized that, yes, my dad had a passion for college students, and he had a passion for sharing the gospel with college students. But what we know BCM to be started with Eugene Briscoe. He passed it on to my dad. And it really got me thinking about, what am I doing with my life? Beyond what I'm doing here, because you guys are that important to me, but it really got me thinking about the big picture and what am I going to leave behind? What are my kids going to do? What impact is my life going to have when I leave? Not just here, but kind of in general. And I've gone to a lot of funerals recently, and it's kind of mixed in there too. Some of them were good, some of them were bad. Some funerals there were a lot of people at, some funerals there were not many people at. And I'm just sitting there going, how many people are going to show up because they cared about me and they loved me? Because I had an impact on their life. And I don't necessarily know that I have the answer. I don't know that I'm supposed to have that answer right now. But it got me thinking about our church and our legacy. I'm going to pass it off for now. We'll get back to that.
There's nothing in the script for this. Chris, by the way, Chris and I have done services together, but he's always done the music and I've done the jabbering, and we're enjoying doing the jabbering together, and so this is fun, and we're passing off some of these things. Now comes the time when I want to share with you what this is all about and why you received a copy of it and hopefully have a pencil close by. We want you to spend some time remembering. We want you to remember an opportunity to scribble some names. Inspiration Rock is a place that exists actually in northern New Mexico. Back when the Spanish were just beginning to explore up the west coast of the U.S., there's this huge place they would go to, and huge steep walls on the side, but you had to go through there in order to go further. And they would take turns climbing as high as they could, and the next person would climb a little higher. And they always scratched their name and the date and an old Spanish phrase that means pass through here. And so there's this record on this rock face of all the people that had come through that place, when they came through that place, and what they had done as they came there. I want you to have a chance to do your own personal Inspiration Rock. Here's a copy of mine. It sits in the first page of my Bible. It is a record of some of the people that God has placed in my life over time. It is a record of some of the places that have been what I call low places. We talk about this, we come out of the Celtic tradition. We're Scottish boys. And one of the parts of Celtic tradition is the notion of low places. These places where you go on earth where it just seems like God is right there with you. And we'll talk some more about those. There are places in your life where God is easy to touch. God is easy to sense, and God is easy to feel. And we want you to think about some of those as well. And then events. On my rock are some of the events, and in underlined letters here are the wreck. And I'll share with you a story from that when we get to that point. Here's the good news for you. You have a piece of paper with a picture on it. You have a pencil, and you have permission from the preacher to scribble during the sermon. Okay, do you realize the gift I'm giving you, kids? Do you realize here you've gotten in trouble for scribbling most of your life during the sermon? But I want you to scribble. I really do want you. And Lacey's going to help scribble some things as we begin to put them up here. But I want you to hear some of the people and places and events that God has used in my life. Not that you'll hear about Joe Graham, and Chris is going to share some from his life. Not that you'll just hear about Chris Graham. We want to prompt your spirit. When I talk about a couple of the people that have been significant in my walk with Christ, I hope that it'll prompt you to jot a name down on this rock. When I talk about some of the places that were low places where I sense God very, very close and near to me, I want you to be able to write some of those places down. And some of the events, some of the places, the youth trips, the youth retreats, the youth whatevers, the conferences, the revivals, the experiences where you say, this event changed my life. Again, we want you to be able to scribble some of these on your own rock. So this is your opportunity to doodle. I hope you will doodle. And I'm going to go first with this one, and then Chris will come, and then Chris will probably will take turns in here as we need to. I want to tell you about Ray DeHart. When I was growing up in First Baptist Church of Radford, Virginia, you wouldn't have known Ray DeHart probably if you'd not been a member of that church. Ray was the chairman of deacons. I don't remember anybody ever being the chairman of deacons but Ray DeHart. Ray DeHart personified what it meant to be a deacon, and that is to be a servant of God within the church. Ray never took it upon himself to make things happen that he wanted to see happen. Ray did things to serve the Lord. There were many a widow who would come home from the grocery store to find that Ray had mowed their yard. Many people who would head off for a weekend with their family that would come home, and Ray would have cleaned out the leaves from their gutters. This man, early in my life and throughout my time in Virginia, personified what it meant to be a servant. And for me, the joining of the words servant and deacon have always gone together because of that man, Ray DeHart. I hope you've had some Ray DeHarts in your life. If you have, jot them down. That's good. Then I want to tell you about Bill Neely. I had youth ministers before Bill Neely, but he's the first one I remember. Bill Neely had long hair. This was back in the 70s. He had some habits that your average youth minister doesn't have, but he was a strong follower of Christ. And sometimes I would go into his office and sit down with him. His door was always open to me, and he always listened to me. Friday nights, when there wasn't a football game in town, we would go to Bill Neely's house. Bill Neely was just everything I'd never understood a youth pastor to be. you'd have to understand First Baptist Church was a little high church. And I grew up in a church where a pastor wore robes into the pulpit every week. And if you didn't know any better, you'd think you're in a very high church setting. But here comes Bill Neely. And I'll never forget the first time he prayed on Wednesday night supper. He said, "Dear God, thank you for sloppy joes and Kool-Aid. Amen." And I thought, this guy's different. This guy's real. And so when he would invite us to his home on Friday nights, we would show up and we would have fun, we would talk, we would keep having fun, and we would keep talking. You know what that turkey was doing for those 3 or 4 years of my life? I didn't realize at the time, but he was discipling us. He had a plan for what we were talking about. He had a plan for what he was trying to teach us. He was the smartest guy I had ever known at that part in terms of investing in the lives of people who didn't even know he was investing in their life. Bill Neely was that kind of person. You ready?
Sure. So one of the obvious ones, I'll just go ahead and get this out of the way. He's kind of sitting over here. It would have been impossible for me to go throughout life being the son of a minister and not say him first and foremost. I think I was in church Wednesday, Sunday morning, and Sunday night from conception.
Yeah.
So, that passage where Paul talks about he is the Jews, I've always changed that around because I've always felt like I was the Baptist of Baptists, the thing that you can go and you can talk about. I've been doing that since I was in the womb. So, I can't tell you the number of times throughout high school, maybe not so much in high school, but throughout college and after, phone calls, lots of phone calls and questions. Because I was looking for answers and I didn't know, but I knew where to go. And so he's always been that rock there for me. I can think of, the people that got me interested in leading worship. Names you probably would never know. Ben Smith, Pat Barrett. They formed a little band when we were in high school, and they ended up being able to travel the country, go into Canada. I think they went some international. We sing a couple of their songs every once in a while. That band has since split up, and Pat Barrett's out doing his own thing now, and he's a touring artist. And we sing one of his songs, "Good Good Father," quite regularly. They led worship at our FCAs, and our FCA was different because it was not something that happened in the morning at school. It happened at a local church on Monday nights because we had so many kids that were coming to FCA that our FCA teacher that was in charge of it didn't have anywhere to house us. And so he reached out to a local church and said, "Okay, let's do it Monday nights on Sabbath service." And that's where those guys got their start playing music together along with our church. And it was just one of those cool times where it wasn't just that somebody was up there leading songs and all that, but it was obvious that they were seeking the face of God whenever they were up leading worship, because they weren't just up leading worship, they were worshiping themselves. And that example, maybe not emotionally, but just trying to find God anytime you're leading worship. That's something I've always tried to strive for. I am not as emotionally charged as those guys. That may be obvious, but Pat Barrett, I would call him just one of the goofiest people in the world. That wears his emotions on his sleeve, and I am not that.
You'd have to know his dad, too.
Oh, Lord.
His dad is goofier than he is.
His dad is a preacher in Atlanta and is a amateur actor. And so when he preaches, he incorporates his acting skills into his preaching, and it's an experience. I'll just say it that way. Probably another one that I would throw in here is somebody named Franklin Scott, and he was my supervisor at the BCM. He started at UGA to be campus minister in 91 or 90.
Too many campus ministers, too many years.
It was a long time ago. When he retired, he was, I think at the time, he was the longest tenured, or one of the longest tenured campus ministers in the state. But early on, he and his wife only had 2 girls, and so he would come to my games, and I was almost like a second child to him. And just throughout the years, obviously he'd be asking my dad about me, and he'd get to see me at events throughout the year. And so when I was in seminary, there was a point when I was struggling finding a job, and he came to me and said, "Hey, how would you like to be an intern at the BCM?" And my first reaction was, "Huh? Why?" It was never something that had crossed my brain, mostly because I was fairly certain I could never work in the same department as my dad. It was just never part of the plan, and I'm thankful God has different plans for me than I have for myself. Because I get to spend 2 years around somebody who, Franklin's knowledge of Scripture is immense. And his ability to just recall Scripture and recall it word for word, and then to expound upon the meaning of Scripture and to give the historical and the cultural context without having to look anything up is astounding. And that's something that one day I hope I can aspire to, that just somebody comes up to me and says, "Hey, what does this passage mean?" And I can just, there, without ever having to think, without having to go to a commentary, without having to go, "Oh, let me go and read that one again," just on the fly, just be able to go, "Here you go." I hope I can get there one day, and he's another example I have.
He calls me with the obscure passages now. Let me look. I want to share with you a couple of the places that have been those low places for me. Those places where God's Spirit seems close and where you feel like he's just right there. For me, one of those places when I was a kid was the beach. We would go to the beach every year. What I didn't realize, of course, one of the reasons I enjoyed the beach so much is because Mom and Dad were paying for the beach. And I learned through the years that we did not come from a very rich family at all. And they would take out a loan every year to go to the beach, and they would pay it back during the year. But the beach became a place where I could just walk, and God felt close. And as I grew older, the beach became a place where I could walk and just sense God's presence. God and I have had some of our best chats on the beach. And at Virginia Beach, near a statue called the Norwegian Lady, I proposed to Gail and asked her to marry me, for real and for sure. And so the beach is one of those special places for me. Another, and I alluded to this morning when I talked about the football team that I worked with for a few years. That football field and the various places that entailed. We were talking with Matt earlier. I can't explain to you what it smells like to be on a bus with a team full of varsity football players returning from an away game.
In August.
In August, whenever it was. As it would get colder, you go, "Lord, I cannot breathe. And what I'm breathing in, I'm afraid it's going to kill me." And so I would lower the window a little bit. "Rev, put the window back up. We're freezing." Well, they were soaked in sweat. They were freezing. But the sidelines I mentioned this morning, the bus rides, the times when we gathered under the goalposts, those were special places to me. Those were the places I remember. Big Harold that I mentioned this morning, that was one of the places where we were doing the Lord's Prayer. And he said, "Rev, you know anything about that prayer?" since you brought it up, Harold, as a matter of fact, I do. And I had a chance to share with him the Lord's Prayer and share with him what it meant and to pour into his life. Those places that sidelines, benches, stinky bus rides, those were places that were significant places for me.
Forget the name of the camp, but after my senior year of high school, I remember we went to a camp. It was somewhere in South Carolina. That's all I remember. May have been Lookup Lodge, I don't remember. But high school was probably a hard time for me church-wise. There were some things that went on in our church growing up where we had to leave during my sophomore year, junior year. The church that we grew up in just made some choices that required Dad to not go there anymore. I stayed on a little bit longer until after a ski trip, and Mom says when she picked me up, she could tell I was never going back. So it was a little hard because I went through, most of my high school experience, and then all of a sudden I'm having to start all of these relationships all over again. And so I really didn't have any personal ties to anybody at this church. I'd grown up in the same neighborhood as a couple of people, but they'd been going to this church their whole life, and so they had other relationships that they were closer to there, and so I was kind of one of the odd kids out all of a sudden. I was already an odd kid out at the other church for different reasons, but that's another story for another time. And so after my senior year, we went to camp, and I can remember, it was normal camp where we would have fun during the day, and we would have a worship service in the morning, we would have one at night, and I remember at night, it was a little more of a traditional worship service where you'd have a band come in and play music, and then have somebody preach, and then have an invitation song, and I remember not really I didn't really feel God's Spirit moving those nights like everybody else did. And at this point, I could play guitar. I started learning to play guitar before my freshman year of high school. And so I brought my guitar. And so 2 nights out of that week, I remember just trying to go off by myself to just spend time with God, to play my guitar and sing songs to Him. And that was all I was trying to do. And I was intentionally going a long way away from everybody else because I wanted to be alone. I wanted some one-on-one time with God. And these 2 separate nights, there was one time when I was at a tennis court, and it was surrounded by pine trees, except for that one little path that you took to get in there. So the way sound works is when you're surrounded by something, normally it keeps sound in and it doesn't go anywhere. When I got done worshiping God that night, I was really surprised when there was a crowd of people behind me and they were all in tears. And the next night, I did the same thing. Except this time I went to the other side of the lake. It was like a 3/4 mile walk, something like that. Sat down on a bench, started playing. Somebody from the same church sat down, and one of his friends, and at that point I was like, okay, whatever. I'm just going to keep singing. I'm not here for them. I'm here for God. And lo and behold, as I'm sitting there singing, one of the guys gets saved. And that was me recognizing in that it wasn't immediate, but it was kind of one of those times where I knew, okay, God's telling me something here. He's telling me, and it's come to be that, music is a very important part of my life. Honestly, another one of those places is here at Fort Creek. Some people know some details about Florida and the church that we came from. Not many do. I've done it that way on purpose. There's not a lot of good stories between me and that pastor. And I'm going to be very guarded.
Careful is a good word.
Yes, with stories, because I'm not going to really tell any. It's not the time or the place. Just to give you a picture of how bad it was, when I left that church, the pastor had an active criminal investigation against him. That's all I'm going to say. There's no details required. Anytime a pastor has an active criminal investigation against him, it's just not good, for a number of reasons. And so, just the process of getting here, and y'all just showing a whole bunch of love to us when we came from a church that really didn't. That I was just there, and the expectation was, okay, get up there, music boy, sing us some songs. To come to a place where you care about us, you care about what's going on in my life, you care about my kids, you care about my wife, my in-laws. That this is one of those places for us, and I can even tell when God moves us on, we're going to look back here fondly of this church family.
Walked with Chris through the middle of a lot of that stuff back in Florida, and they handled it well. I'll tell you about a couple of events now in my life. We've talked about people. We've talked about places. Now I want to touch on a couple of events that have been significant in my life. The birth of my children was phenomenal. I heard all the stories. Nobody really much older than me ever got to go into the delivery room. But I got to be there. I got to experience that with Gail. Gail was not happy with the first child. It took 18 hours of labor, going on 24, depending on when you started the clock. I remember one of my campus minister buddies walked in the door as she was going into transition labor. And he said, "Hi, how are you doing?" And she said, "David Rowland, get out of this room." I think he learned a very important lesson that day. But one of the 4 of the most significant events in my life, starting with our first grandchild and ending with Jedediah, has been, and I don't know that I can do this right now even, to hold your baby's baby is something that is truly, truly amazing. I jokingly say to prospective grandparents, there are 2 incredible parts of being a new grandparent. Number 1 is holding your baby's baby. There will never be anything like that. And number 2, you have no idea how expensive it is to be married to a new grandmother. Both of those are true. But I have held each of these 4 grandchildren. Just incredibly grateful for the blessing of them and the blessing of my children. I hope some of you are scribbling like mad right now. Another story I want to share with you, it goes back to the year after the wreck that I was in. I was a pretty torn up puppy. I had a pretty severe brain injury, and I had ribs that were broken, had back that was thoracic. I was a messed up guy. I was in the hospital for quite a while. Came home finally, and I was a pretty banged up puppy. One of the things that the insurance company wanted me to do after a few weeks, they said, "We want you to go. Because of the head injury, we need you to do some neurological stuff, and we'd really like for you to see a neuropsychologist who will do the kinds of testing that they need to do now and then in a few months to see how you're doing with the brain injury. And then you've lost a significant person in your life. Gene Briscoe was a mentor and a friend. and a grandfather to our kids. And I thought, okay, I'll do that. But I've had classes in counseling at seminary. I've walked with people through major traumas in their life. I'll go see Hank Fallon and I'll do the TAP tests and whatever else they are. And, I expect in a couple of weeks, after I've seen him a couple of times, he'll go, I'm just amazed at how well you're doing. Nine months later, when I shook hands with Hank Fallon for the final time, he's the name of the guy that was my neuropsychologist, and that I didn't spend too cocky times with where I was all proud of myself with how I was doing. But I had 9 months of him asking me hard questions, of him making me think about things I didn't want to think about, with him making me get in touch with what is at the very root and being of who I am and my call. And 9 months later, I shook hands with Hank Fallon, and he wished me well. And he is a name that is prominently on my rock.
So one of these for me, if you've heard, most of y'all have heard my testimony before. When I went to college to be a baseball player. I was going to do my 2 years at Truett McConnell, what is now Truett McConnell University. At the time, it was just a college, and it wasn't even junior college. It was below junior college. And so Truett used to have a campus in Watkinsville, and so Truett used to be known as a great feeder school for UGA, where you would just go get your core classes out of the way, transfer somewhere else, and keep going on with life. And so that was my plan. I was going to go play 2 years, hopefully do well, have another college say, hey, we want you to come play for me. Okay. I don't even remember how far into the first season, fall.
At the beginning of the second season.
It was the fall of
Yeah.
freshman year. I don't remember how quickly it was. It was sometime August, early September. It was early on. I don't know if it's fully torn or if it's partially torn, but the ulnar collateral ligament goes between that bone and that bone in your elbow. And I either tore it all the way or partially tore it. I'm not really sure. I never had an MRI. Back in those days, if you pay attention to baseball, you would hear the term Tommy John surgery. It is the surgery that they do to basically fix that ligament. And that surgery has saved countless number of Major League pitchers' careers because they can do that and then go on and keep playing. Well, when you're at a small little Baptist private school in Georgia, they don't necessarily have had the resources back then to take a player like me and give him that surgery. They barely were even able to give scholarships out. Nobody was on a full ride at Truett. You might have gotten like a quarter to a half of your tuition taken care of if you were on scholarship, but nobody was on a full ride. And so I played for a year and a half with a partially torn or fully torn ligament in my elbow because I am hard-headed. And I want he's laughing. I wanted to do what I wanted to do, and what I wanted to do was play baseball, and by God, I was going to do it. Even if it required a whole bunch of physical pain. But that was God very early on in my college career trying to get my attention to tell me that's not what you're going to do the rest of your life. Probably after that, this was a hard one. I'm trying to come up with something. I mentioned Franklin, and probably that day when he came to ask me to be an intern, having that conversation, because when I say we struggled to find me a job, we're talking a 3-year period where I was in seminary trying to find a church to work at, and when you're in seminary and you're not in a seminary town, they want you to have 5 years of experience mechanics and be the age I was at, but they didn't want to be the church to give out the experience. So it was very hard to find somewhere to plug into and to be in ministry. And so that I can honestly say that was one of those points that changed the course of my life. It was probably a week before that where I was really struggling. I don't even know if I've told you this story. I was really struggling with what God was doing because I had volunteered at the church my parents were going to when I started seminary. We had to be actively involved in ministry in some fashion while I was in seminary, be it volunteer, part-time, full-time, whatever you could get, essentially. And so I was like, okay, this is where my parents are going. I'll go and ask the music minister if he could use some help. And he's like, yeah, sure, we can use help. It was probably a silly question. But after some things happened in that church and Lacey and I left, I had really felt a strong call from God saying, okay, it's time for you to do this full time. I don't want you to do any of these other jobs, but I want you to begin to work for me and for me only. And I was like, okay, God, I'm going to go down that road. I'm going to go. Well, almost 3 years later, I was sitting there one night, and I think Lacey got home from work, and I don't remember what kick-started it, but she came in the door, and I was like, okay, I'm going to sell all this music equipment. I'm going to be done with it, and I'm going to go do whatever I have to do to make some money, because I'm tired of living like this. We're living on her paycheck only. And I think it's one of the 3 times Lacey's ever seen me cry. I was broken at that point. And then a week later, Franklin calls me. Obviously, I decided not to sell all the music equipment, and she talked me back from that cliff. So, yeah.
By the way, I'll throw this in for free. He played third base at Trip McConnell. I've never seen anybody that could throw a flat ball to first base. No, none of this stuff, A flat, at least 90-mile-an-hour ball to first base. And the day he made that decision with the future, he called us and he said, Dad, Mom, I just want you to know I'm retiring today. It's a college student. And he said to us, I'm retiring today. And I thought, what a mature way to handle what has got to be a really, really tough time. I hope, as you've seen some of the scribbles from my life, I hope you've scribbled some things on your inspiration rock. And I hope it becomes something that as you open it and as you reflect on these folks, I hope that it is helpful for you to look back and see the hand of God touching your life. We started with the first few verses of Hebrews 11. I want to end with the first few verses of Hebrews 12 and a challenge. Here are the first few verses of Hebrews 12. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Every now and then, I have to pull out this inspiration rock, and it helps me when those times come that I'm feeling a little weary and I come close to losing heart. And here's the challenge. As you consider the people, places, and events that God has used to touch you, are you ready to become the names on other people's Inspiration Rock? That's the challenge part of this. There are people that you've written down that God has used to touch you. Every one of you, regardless of age, need to be ready to let God use you to become the name that somebody puts on their Inspiration Rock. Maybe it's a kid in the children's ministry. Maybe it's a young person in the youth group. A single mom who's struggling to know which way to turn and just feels so alone. Maybe it's a neighbor who drives by your house or drives by this church every day, but has never been invited to come and sit with you and to be a part of this place. Maybe it's family in the Deering community that you haven't even met yet, but they're not even sure anybody even knows them or cares about them. Maybe it's a lost person, and I've had this conversation so many times through the years, who says, God could never love me for all the things I've done in my life. Yes, he does. Yes, he will. There's nothing you can do that will ever make God love you any less. But he wants you to turn your life toward him and come with him and accept him and let him lead your life. God has reached into your life and touched you with some wonderful people. Are you ready to be one of those people? There have been some remarkable places that have become low places where you sense God's presence. Are you ready to share some of those special places with others and help them find those own places in their lives? I know it's a pain to go on youth retreats, but it is a pain that is well worth every minute of it because of what happens in the lives of kids when they have a chance to be quiet enough, long enough to hear the voice of God in their lives. Are you ready to be one of those people? And there's some events that God has used to bring healing and grace to you. Are you ready to create some of those same events in your family's life, in your life, and in the life of this community? This community desperately needs a church not just that gathers near them. This church needs, this community needs a church that turns around and faces them and reaches out to them and brings them with them. Don't just invite somebody to come to church. Invite them to come sit with you. Invite them to lunch after you're done. Invite them to your life. Invite them to have a chance to have God speak into them.
And I'm going to go back to what started all this, legacy. What we've been talking about is a lot of legacy. And there's a lot of people in our lives that have left a spiritual legacy. And generally they're the people that end up on your Inspiration Rock. They've left a piece of who they are spiritually with you. Churches do the same thing. I would call those that are here on Sunday nights our core group. I know it's probably down a little bit because it's a holiday weekend and all that, but our core group of people, the people that no matter what's going to happen, you're here, you're dependable, you can be asked to help and do just about anything. That's you guys. So you guys are the ones that care and love. Not this building, but this church. This group of people that calls themselves Full Creek Baptist Church. And from time to time, we have to ask the question, what are we leaving behind? When the time comes that this church, whenever it is, and I don't know when this is, but when this church ceases to exist, what are people going to say about us? And you get there by saying, what are people saying about this church right now? And if we can't answer that question, Thompson. People know who Fort Creek is in Thompson. Ask that question. Hey, I go to Fort Creek Baptist Church. What do you think of that church? You don't even have to mention you go there. You might get a better answer if you say you don't go there. You might get a more honest answer. Let me say it that way. I asked that question one day. I was up getting some stuff that we were having printed, and I was up at Sean Kelly's. And he said, oh, you're at Fort Creek, and you work there? Yeah, I do. I was like, cool. Do you want to hear the biggest complaint I get about your church? Okay. I'll listen. And I don't know if this, I personally, I think this was probably just Sean's personal opinion. I don't think that this was necessarily that he had a whole bunch of people from the community come and say, hey, somebody needs to go tell somebody at Fort Creek, because I think this is really just his opinion. Becky, you're laughing because you know that's true. But that we aren't involved in the community enough. And I don't really know where that came from, but, you know, anytime we can do anything like the Easter egg hunt, or the National Night Out, or the Christmas tree lighting, where we're out there and we're interacting and trying to create some relationships with people that will not walk through that door, that's when we're involved with the community. That's when we are taking this light that we have that is called Jesus, and we're taking it to our community. And I think the more we can do things like that, of where, you know, growing up, we were at a church where it was, y'all come, and people came. Smoke Rise Baptist Church back in those days probably ran 1,000 plus on a Sunday morning. It was one of the churches in the Atlanta area, not the church, but one of them. And so it was very normal for them to say, yeah, just come. I don't think we're in one of those communities where people are just going to come to church anymore. I think it's one of those things where we're going to have to go out to where they are, meet them where they're at, and take the gospel to them.
And I cut off my mic, so bear with me now. Is there a song to follow? Oop, apparently there is. I love Flexible Church. The names on the rock, the places on the rock, the events on the rock, those are places God has used to touch your life. The challenge is, will you be one of those people looking forward? And the legacy Chris is talking about is what happens generation after generation as you invest in people who invest in people who invest in people. You lead people to the Lord, who lead people to the Lord, who lead people to the Lord. And there is no finer legacy. No finer legacy at all. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for the people you've placed in our lives. Thank you that you have used some of your finest servants, some of the finest events